What if the love you're holding on to isn't love at all, but fear dressed in familiarity? What if the relationship that keeps you up at night, the one that burns your chest and tears at your mind, is not your destiny, but your distraction? Be honest. Are you staying because it's real, or because you're terrified of starting over? We convince ourselves that endurance is strength, that loyalty means sacrificing our peace, that staying silent is noble. But silence isn't always patience. Sometimes it's self-abandonment. Stoicism doesn't ask you to feel nothing. It asks you to see everything clearly. But what about what you keep pretending to feel, just to avoid what's real? This video will confront the hardest truth of all, not when to leave, but why you already know it's time. If that strikes something inside you, consider subscribing for more clarity, because every time you choose truth over comfort, you're building something stronger than any relationship, a self that no longer negotiates with pain just to feel wanted. They always say the right thing at the right time. It sounds sincere. It sounds like change. But the truth is, you've heard it before. You've walked this loop so many times, you've memorized the turns. One tearful apology, one emotional promise, one deep conversation that feels like a breakthrough. But then you wake up a week later and somehow you're explaining your pain all over again, like it never counted the first time. You're not stuck because you don't understand what's going on. You're stuck because part of you still believes it's going to be different. That this time the apology is real. That this time they mean it. That this time they see you. But patterns don't lie. They aren't confused or emotional. They're consistent. They don't shift because you want them to. They repeat until they're confronted or until you finally walk away. The hard truth is that patterns reveal the person, not their intentions, not their words, not their potential. The repeated choices they make, especially when things are hard, show you exactly who they are right now. If someone constantly disappears when you're vulnerable, or raises their voice when they're cornered, or changes the subject when you try to speak your truth, that's not a flaw to be fixed. That's a pattern. And a pattern is a quiet confession. It tells you what they truly value. It tells you how much energy they're willing to give. It tells you how much responsibility they're capable of holding. The mistake we make is thinking that patterns are temporary obstacles, that if we just love harder, or wait longer, or word things better, they'll change. But that belief is a trap, and it's not hopeful. It's self-neglect wrapped in romanticism. The moment you realize that patterns are louder than promises, you start paying attention differently. You stop listening to their explanations and start watching their actions. You stop clinging to apologies and start observing habits. How do they treat your silence? Do they get curious about your distance, or do they fill the space with assumptions? How do they respond when you're hurting? Do they lean in with empathy or pull away with frustration? How do they handle your boundaries? Do they respect them or push just enough to keep control? These are the small, quiet signals that people reveal about themselves every day. But we miss them when we're only tuned into potential. It's not cruel to accept someone as they are. In fact, it's one of the kindest things you can do, for them and for yourself. Because the longer you stay with someone based on who they might become, the more of yourself you sacrifice to a version of them that may never exist. You start editing your needs to avoid conflict. You start shrinking your truth to protect their ego. You start becoming a version of yourself who tolerates what you used to cry over. That's not growth, that's erosion. And sometimes the only way to stop losing yourself is to acknowledge what their pattern has been trying to tell you all along. This is who they are. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And when you let that sink in, not just understand it, but believe it, you stop waiting for people to become someone else. You stop giving endless chances to the same pain. You stop confusing patience with self-abandonment. Because at some point, continuing to stay hopeful in the face of repetition becomes a form of denial. You don't need to hate them. You don't need a dramatic breakup. But you do need to ask yourself what it's costing you to keep dancing around a truth you already know. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving someone who hurt you. It's leaving someone who keeps promising they won't, because that promise holds just enough light to make you doubt the dark you're living in. But life isn't meant to be lived in that in-between. You weren't made to survive off crumbs of connection. And the relationship you're in shouldn't require you to ignore yourself just to keep the peace. Pay attention to what keeps happening. Pay attention to how it makes you feel. Because your body knows. Your gut knows. Your silence knows. And deep down, a part of you has known for a long time. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." If your thoughts are always anxious, always guarded, always trying to decode someone else's inconsistency, your soul will reflect that confusion. But when your thoughts shift, when they become rooted in truth, in boundaries, in clarity, your soul becomes calm again. You don't need a sign louder than that. You just need to trust it. Because the pattern isn't going to change unless they want it to. But your life, that can change the moment you decide to stop waiting. Love shouldn't feel like something you have to survive. It shouldn't leave you tired before you even speak. If you find yourself rehearsing every word, softening your tone just to keep the air from cracking, you're not speaking freely, you're bracing. Your nervous system is working overtime just to keep you emotionally safe in a space that's supposed to protect you. When being near someone starts to feel like walking through a minefield, you're no longer in love, you're in survival. And the worst part is, most people don't even realize it. It creeps in slowly. A raised voice here, a guilt trip there, a little silence used as punishment. Over time, your peace becomes a memory, and anxiety becomes the default setting. But you tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself every relationship has problems. You convince yourself this is what love takes. But love doesn't take your breath away just to suffocate you. It's not supposed to cost you the one thing keeping you grounded, your inner calm. You weren't made to shrink in someone else's presence. And yet, day by day, you make yourself smaller, more agreeable, less expressive, all for the sake of not starting something. But in doing that, you've already started something else. The slow erosion of your voice. And once your voice is gone, everything else begins to fade too. Your needs, your joy, your sense of self. You go through the motions, smile when you're supposed to, show up out of habit, but inside, it's just quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that screams in the background, asking why you keep betraying yourself to hold on to something that's no longer holding you. It's a quiet kind of disappearing. You're not being pushed out. You're slowly walking away from your own reflection every time you choose tension over truth. It's not that they hit you. It's not that they screamed. It's that you can't remember the last time you felt safe enough to just be. That should matter. Peace is not a luxury. It's the baseline. It's the ground beneath love, not the reward for enduring it. Any connection that requires you to abandon yourself in order to preserve it is not a connection. It's a trap. And somewhere deep down, you know this. You can feel the disconnect between who you are in their presence and who you are when they're not around. One is quiet, cautious, calculating. The other breathes. You know which one is real. The question is, why do you keep choosing the version of you that disappears? The answer isn't always because you're weak. Sometimes it's because you've been conditioned to believe that discomfort means loyalty, that love is sacrifice, that staying through suffering is noble. But endurance is not always virtue. Sometimes it's just fear dressed up as patience. And if you're staying just to avoid being alone, understand this. Being alone with your peace is better than being partnered with your pain. Peace isn't about perfection, it's about presence. It's about being able to sit beside someone and feel your shoulders drop, your breath steady, your thoughts clear. That kind of peace doesn't drain you, it restores you. It doesn't make you second-guess yourself. It makes you feel safe enough to show all of yourself. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." And sometimes bravery isn't loud. It doesn't always look like confrontation or dramatic exits. Sometimes bravery is the moment you say, "I deserve better than this tension." Sometimes bravery is choosing to protect your peace over protecting someone else's comfort. It's walking away not because they were the worst, but because they kept you from becoming your best. No one should have that kind of power over your peace. Not someone you love. Not someone who says they love you. You teach people how to treat you, not by what you demand, but by what you tolerate. Every time you silence your discomfort to keep things steady, you send a message. My peace is negotiable. But it isn't, or at least it shouldn't be. The cost of staying is not just the arguments or the silence or the pressure. The cost is the version of you that never fully breathes again. That version starts to disappear quietly, then all at once. You'll notice it when laughter feels unfamiliar, when solitude feels more nourishing than company, when you begin fantasizing about a life where you're not constantly bracing for impact. This isn't about being dramatic. This is about being honest. How much of you are you losing just to keep the illusion alive? How much energy are you pouring into staying calm when you should be feeling seen? Peace isn't found in the absence of conflict. It's found in the presence of alignment. It's when who you are, what you need, and what your relationship gives you all exist in the same place. Anything less than that might feel familiar, but it isn't love. Not the kind that lasts, not the kind that heals. Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And the first step to mastering yourself is protecting the energy that sustains you. If love costs you your peace, you're not gaining a partner, you're losing your foundation. And eventually, no matter how deep the connection feels, it will crumble under the weight of everything you've been holding back just to keep it going. You can love someone deeply and still choose distance. You can miss someone terribly and still walk away. Because sometimes loving yourself looks like leaving. And peace, the kind that doesn't tremble when you speak, the kind that doesn't vanish when they enter the room, that's not optional, that's survival. And it's the one thing you should never give up, no matter who you're trying to hold on to. It's one of the hardest truths to face. Not that they didn't become who you needed, but that they were never going to. You weren't in love with the person in front of you. You were in love with the version of them you built in your mind, the version that apologized first, the version that understood your silences, the version that did the inner work and finally met you halfway. But that version doesn't live here. That version lives in your imagination, stitched together from hope, memory, and the deep ache of unmet needs. And hope, while beautiful, can become a dangerous thing when it blinds you to what's real, when it keeps you clinging to a possibility instead of choosing a reality. There's no shame in wanting someone to grow, but if their growth becomes a condition for your peace, you're no longer loving them. You're surviving them. Potential is seductive. It lets you tell a better story than the one you're living. It allows you to believe that this tension, this confusion, this repeated disappointment is temporary. That all of it is leading somewhere better if you just hold on a little longer. But eventually, you have to admit what's happening. You're not holding on to love. You're holding on to a fantasy. And fantasies don't come with reciprocity. They come with longing. They come with overthinking. They come with the constant weight of waiting for someone else to catch up to the version of them you've already made room for. But no one ever asked you to make that room. You did that on your own, and you keep doing it, at your own expense. It's easy to confuse love with healing, to look at someone's pain and see your own reflection. Maybe you know what it's like to be misunderstood. Maybe you've been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. And so, when you see them struggling, you empathize. You want to believe that with enough patience, enough kindness, enough effort, they'll transform. But what if the person you're really trying to save is yourself? Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And sometimes what we call fate, a connection we can't walk away from, a person we can't stop thinking about, is actually a wound replaying itself. We project our pain onto someone else, and then we try to fix them, hoping it will heal us. But that's not love, that's reenactment, and it rarely ends with resolution. There's nothing wrong with seeing potential in someone, but it becomes dangerous when that vision overshadows the truth, when we start tolerating disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional neglect in the name of who they could become. You start justifying their actions by comparing them not to your needs, but to their worst moments. You start saying things like, "They didn't mean it," or "They're going through a lot," or "It's just a phase." But what if it's not a phase? What if this is who they are, and the change you're waiting for is never going to come? The more you delay that question, the deeper the denial becomes. You don't need to hate them to leave. You just need to love yourself enough to stop being in a one-sided story. You teach yourself how to suffer quietly, how to normalize discomfort, how to call emotional inconsistency complexity. And the longer you stay, the more you forget what it feels like to be met fully, to be heard without explaining, to be held without condition. Potential doesn't hold you. It doesn't show up in hard conversations. It doesn't call you back after a bad fight. Potential is passive. It just waits to be realized while you do all the work of staying hopeful. And eventually, you wake up exhausted. Not because the relationship ended, but because you spent so long trying to make it begin. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. But when your thoughts are wrapped around what someone could become, your life becomes a waiting room, one where you're constantly rearranging your boundaries, your expectations, your truth, just to stay seated. But you weren't meant to wait endlessly for someone to grow into what you need. You were meant to live, to be loved in real time, not in theory. You were meant to build something with someone who meets you where you are, not one who always leaves you chasing the version of them you wish they were. Hope is not a strategy. Love is not a rehabilitation center, and healing is not something you can do for someone else, no matter how deeply you care. People don't change because you believe in them. They change because they believe in themselves. And if they don't, no amount of waiting, loving, or sacrificing will make the difference. Let them be who they are. But don't lose who you are in the process, because when you love potential more than reality, you don't just lose time. You lose clarity. You lose energy. You lose the version of yourself that once knew what it felt like to be chosen, not tolerated. Walking away doesn't mean you gave up on them. It means you stopped abandoning yourself. It means you finally realized that the future you were holding on to was only alive in your mind. And no matter how vivid your vision was, no matter how badly you wanted it to be true, you can't date a dream. You can only choose what's real. And reality, when chosen fully, can be so much more beautiful than the fiction we fight for, especially when it includes peace, presence, and a kind of love that doesn't require you to suffer for it to grow. Not all pain shows up in shouting matches or slammed doors. Sometimes the most unbearable pain is the quiet one, the one that hides in plain sight. It creeps into the spaces where conversation used to live, where affection used to flow without effort. You sit across from them at dinner, and the air feels heavy with everything not being said. You ask how their day was, not because you care anymore, but because it feels too awkward not to. And when they answer with a vague "fine," you nod, smile, and continue chewing, pretending that everything tastes like something other than emotional numbness. There's no fight to have anymore, no disagreement to fix. Just the thick, suffocating silence of two people who have slowly stopped trying. And that's what makes it harder to leave. When nothing obvious is breaking, but everything inside you already has. That silence eats away at you slowly. It doesn't yell. It whispers things you don't want to hear, like how you don't feel seen anymore, or how your presence has become background noise, or how you're giving energy to something that hasn't reflected any warmth in return for a long time. You tell yourself it's just a phase, that maybe everyone in long-term relationships hits this point, that maybe the spark always fades eventually. But deep down, you know this isn't about time or routine. It's about emotional distance, the kind that feels like a canyon between two people who once couldn't go a day without sharing everything. Now you hesitate before speaking. You wonder if your words will even land, and when they don't, you wonder if maybe you should have stayed silent too. There's a unique kind of loneliness that comes from being with someone who doesn't notice you anymore. It's different than being single. When you're alone, your silence is your own. It's peaceful. It's yours to fill or enjoy. But when you're sitting next to someone who once knew the depth of your thoughts and now barely asks how you are, that silence becomes unbearable, because it reminds you of what was and what will likely never be again. And so you keep showing up, emotionally underfed, spiritually dimmed, hoping that one day they'll just look at you and see you again. But people don't always come back. Sometimes they leave without leaving, and you're the one left holding the weight of the goodbye that never actually got spoken. You begin to second-guess your instincts. You wonder if you're expecting too much, if maybe you're just too sensitive. Maybe this is how love matures, quiet, still, uneventful. But love is not supposed to feel like being tolerated. It's not supposed to make you feel like a burden. You shouldn't have to beg for eye contact or feel lucky when they ask about your day. That's not emotional maturity. That's emotional starvation. When the little gestures that were once routine now feel like rare acts of kindness, something's not growing, it's dying. And you can feel it. Every day it gets a little colder, a little quieter, a little less alive. And in that silence, you start disappearing, piece by piece, smile by forced smile. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." That's the ache you carry, not that there's no one beside you, but that there's no one truly with you. The kind of loneliness where you have a thought, a feeling, an insight, and you turn to share it, only to realize the person you're sharing your life with isn't listening, or worse, doesn't care. That's not partnership, that's proximity. And proximity without presence feels like rejection on repeat. You don't need someone to fill the room. You need someone who fills the space between your soul and your skin, with understanding, not just physical presence. Sometimes we stay because there's no disaster, no betrayal, nothing bad enough to justify leaving. But that mindset keeps people stuck in emotional purgatory for years. You don't have to wait for damage to become visible to validate your pain. Emotional neglect is still neglect. Silence, when used as avoidance, is still a form of abandonment. When you stop expressing your needs because you're tired of the blank stares, that's not acceptance, it's resignation. And if you're constantly having to convince yourself that this is normal, that this is enough, it probably isn't. We weren't made to live in constant compromise with our own emotional well-being. Eventually, the silence doesn't just exist between you and them. It enters your inner world. You stop journaling, stop dreaming, stop reaching, because somewhere inside you decided it's safer to expect less, to need less, to hope for nothing so nothing can hurt you. But apathy is not peace, and being emotionally numb is not the same as being healed. When you stay in silence long enough, it becomes your language. You start forgetting how to speak your truth. And even if someone asked, "What's wrong?" you might not know how to answer anymore. Because when no one asks for so long, you start to believe you no longer matter. Seneca once said, "A sword never kills anybody. It is a tool in the killer's hand." Silence, too, can be a tool. It can be used to avoid, to manipulate, to punish. But it can also be used to awaken. The silence you're experiencing might not be the end of the relationship, but the beginning of your awareness. The awareness that connection doesn't die all at once. It dies slowly, through days of unspoken pain, through moments of unmet needs, through conversations that feel like obligations instead of desire. And that awareness might be the very thing that saves you. Because the first step out of numbness is naming the absence. It's saying, this silence isn't peace. It's pain I haven't been allowed to speak. So where does that leave you? Maybe still at the table, still in the room, still wearing a smile that doesn't quite reach your eyes. But now you carry something different, awareness. And with that comes a choice. Not a demand to leave, not a script to follow, but a gentle, powerful reminder that your emotions are not too much, that your longing for connection is valid, that your voice, however quiet it's become, still matters. You don't need an explosion to justify walking away. Sometimes the absence of sound is enough, and the decision to leave doesn't have to come with fire. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with the quiet certainty that you deserve more than to be slowly erased by someone who once promised to see you. You deserve to be met, not just endured. And if silence is all they offer, it's okay to become the one who finally speaks, for yourself. It starts with good intentions. You tell yourself you're being kind. That love means being there for someone, no matter how long it takes them to get it together. You convince yourself that you're the steady one, the patient one, the one who can handle their chaos, because you see their potential buried underneath the wreckage. So you stay. You explain things gently, again and again. You make excuses for their outbursts, soften the edges of their neglect, and swallow your hurt just to avoid making them feel guilty. You think this is love. You think you're being strong. But the truth is, strength doesn't mean ignoring your own needs, and love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Somewhere along the way, what began as support turns into supervision. You become the one tracking their moods, anticipating their triggers, adjusting your voice so they don't shut down, correcting your words so they don't spiral. You're not just loving them anymore, you're managing them. And that kind of emotional labor is draining in a way that no one else sees. It doesn't explode, it erodes. And slowly, you begin to lose the parts of yourself that once felt whole. Your joy gets quieter, your spark gets dimmer. Your peace becomes conditional. Not on how you feel, but on how they're doing. You don't realize it at first, but your well-being has been tied to their unpredictability. And that's not love, that's survival. When you begin to confuse control with care, you blur the line between helping someone and trying to save them. You tell yourself, if I love them enough, they'll finally see it. If I show up every time they fall apart, they'll eventually stop breaking things. But it never happens like that, because real change doesn't come from being rescued. It comes from being responsible. And when you constantly rescue someone from the consequences of their own behavior, you rob them of the very growth you're hoping for. You're not just shielding them from pain, you're shielding them from truth. And in doing so, you're also shielding yourself from the fear that if you stop trying, the whole relationship might collapse. Sometimes we don't want them to fall apart, not because we think they can't handle it, but because we're afraid of what their fall will mean for us. That we'll be alone, that we'll have to admit it's over, that we'll lose the story we've been telling ourselves about what this could become. So we take on the role of fixer. We become the planner, the reminder, the regulator of emotions. We think this is loyalty, but it's often fear in disguise. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it's also terrifying to accept someone else as they are, especially when that person refuses to meet you halfway. And so instead of acceptance, we choose illusion. We choose control. We call it love. But love doesn't demand that you be a healer. It doesn't ask you to be the one who carries the entire weight of the relationship on your shoulders. That's not devotion. That's imbalance. And imbalance, even when wrapped in good intentions, becomes manipulation. not in a cruel way, but in a quiet one. You try to nudge them toward clarity, thinking you're just encouraging growth. You withhold your real feelings to keep the peace, thinking you're being mature. You shapeshift into someone more digestible, more careful, more tolerant, thinking you're being supportive. But what you're really doing is managing, curating, controlling, all because you're afraid that if you don't do the work, no one will. There's a part of you that believes love should be hard, that relationships demand sacrifice. And yes, all love comes with effort, but effort should never come at the cost of your own truth. If you have to constantly analyze your behavior while they remain unaware of theirs, you're not growing together. You're shrinking so they don't feel insecure. You're making yourself small enough to avoid triggering their wounds. And eventually, you stop recognizing the person you've become, someone who stays silent during arguments, who walks on eggshells even in moments of calm, who mistakes emotional labor for intimacy. That's not love. That's burnout dressed up as commitment. You don't owe anyone your emotional oxygen. You don't need to earn your place by being the most tolerant, the most understanding, the most endlessly forgiving. Love shouldn't feel like endurance, and care shouldn't mean control. True love meets you at the middle. It doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be felt honestly and freely. If you're constantly trying to orchestrate their healing while ignoring your own, that's not support, it's self-abandonment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back, not to punish them, not to make a point, but to remind yourself that you are not their savior. You are not responsible for their emotional regulation. You are allowed to stop trying to fix things that were never yours to repair. You are allowed to choose rest over repair, and most importantly, you are allowed to want a relationship where love flows without needing to be managed at all times. Epictetus once said, "People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them." And sometimes the view we take of our own role in someone's life is what keeps us trapped. We think our love will be the turning point. We think our care will be enough to pull them through. But the truth is, we can only meet people where they're willing to meet themselves. And if they're not willing to face their own chaos, no amount of support will change that. Not your kindness, not your sacrifices, not even your love. So here's the quiet truth that's hard to say aloud. If love requires constant control to keep it alive, it's not love anymore. It's obligation. It's fear. It's a cycle that will keep spinning as long as you're willing to be the engine. And one day, you'll wake up tired. Not just tired of them, but tired of yourself. Tired of how much of your life you've spent trying to prove your love through your silence, your effort, your endurance. And that's when the shift begins. That's when you stop confusing control with care, and you start remembering what it means to simply be loved, not managed, seen, not supervised, held, not handled. And that difference, that's what will set you free. You can give someone the sun, and they'll still complain about the light being too bright. You can pour your heart into their cracks, thinking your love will seal what life has broken, and still watch them collapse under the weight of their own choices. That's the hardest thing to accept when you love someone who refuses to grow. No matter how warm you are, how patient, how present, growth is an inside job. You can be the most nurturing presence in the world, but if they have no desire to plant roots, you'll just become the soil they strip bare. Not because they're malicious, but because they've learned to survive without ever learning to rise. At first, it doesn't feel that way. At first, it feels good to be needed, to be the steady one, the one who sees potential, offers support, becomes the reason they get through a hard day. You tell yourself you're helping, that you're making a difference, that they just need time. But time doesn't change people. Awareness does. And without awareness, they'll stay stuck in the same patterns, making the same excuses, repeating the same self-sabotage, all while your energy is being drained, trying to pull them forward. But a person who isn't willing to meet you at growth will never truly meet you at love. You start thinking if you say the right thing, encourage them at the right time, or create the right environment, they'll finally step into who they're meant to be. But transformation doesn't respond to environment alone. It responds to responsibility. You can't make someone ready. You can't force someone to care. And you cannot keep building a life around someone who won't even lay the first brick on their own. Eventually, your love doesn't feel like love anymore. It starts to feel like a job, a duty, a quiet resignation that if you just keep going, they'll one day arrive at who you've always believed they could become. But the longer you wait, the more you realize that belief was never mutual. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And that's what you're up against. Not just bad habits or immaturity, but a deep resistance to self-confrontation. You try to be gentle. You try not to push. You justify, minimize, reframe. But deep down you know they're not trying. They're not questioning their patterns. They're not actively choosing growth. They're coasting on your effort, surviving on your consistency, hiding inside your compassion. And if you don't pull back, you'll start hiding too. From your needs, from your purpose, from your peace. You cannot be someone's weather system. You're not the sun, the rain, the seasons, all wrapped into one. You are not here to regulate someone else's inner world. It is not your job to motivate them daily, hold their emotions together, or drag them toward accountability. And yet, that's exactly what happens when you mistake love for rescue. You become the one adjusting everything, your tone, your timing, your truth, just to avoid triggering their fragility, and slowly you become the environment they survive in, not the partner they evolve with. That's not growth, that's caretaking. And caretaking will always leave you empty if you're the only one doing the work. You may think it's noble. You may believe that sticking it out makes you strong. And yes, love asks us to stretch. But it should never require you to stretch so thin that you forget your own shape. If you're constantly the one doing the work, carrying the hope, imagining the future while they stagnate in the present, that's not a relationship. That's a fantasy you're maintaining alone. A fantasy that becomes more costly the longer you ignore the reality. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. You can't keep begging someone to become what they've shown you they don't want to be. You can't force alignment with someone who refuses to move. And it's not cruel to walk away from that. It's clarity, it's courage. Because continuing to be their source of comfort while they stay rooted in avoidance doesn't make you loyal, it makes you an accomplice to their stagnation. Eventually, the truth becomes unavoidable, that no amount of nurturing will ever be enough if they have no intention of blooming, that your presence, no matter how loving, will only be background noise in a life they're not actively trying to build. And the longer you stay, the more invisible you'll feel. Because you're not being loved, you're being leaned on. There's a difference, and the longer you blur that line, the harder it becomes to remember what it felt like to be loved for who you are, not just for what you provide. It's okay to want someone to grow. It's human to hope, but hope isn't supposed to cost you your dignity. It's not supposed to exhaust your soul. You are allowed to let go of the dream that someone might change, especially when all the evidence says they won't. Not because you're giving up, but because you're giving yourself back. Back to peace, back to balance, back to the version of you that doesn't carry the emotional weight of two people. Seneca said, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." And in relationships, craving someone's potential while being deprived of their presence is a kind of poverty we rarely name. It leaves you emotionally bankrupt, with nothing left to invest in your own healing. You cannot love someone into maturity. You cannot water a plant that refuses the soil. And you cannot keep showing up for someone who won't even show up for themselves. So, when the silence between you grows wider, when your words feel like echoes in a room they no longer stand in, when your encouragement feels like noise they've learned to tune out, pause. Step back. And ask yourself not if they'll change, but if they want to. And if the answer is no, it's okay to stop. Not because you didn't care, but because you finally realized caring alone isn't enough. People grow when they're ready, not when you believe in them, not when you create the perfect conditions, not when you love them unconditionally. They grow when they're willing to sit with their pain, confront their shadows, and step into discomfort. If they're not doing that, then all your effort becomes a one-sided agreement, and you deserve more than that. You deserve a relationship built on mutual evolution, not one that demands your emotional labor just to stay afloat. Let them go. Let them stay stuck if they choose to. Let your love become the thing that frees you, not the thing that keeps you anchored to someone who's already stopped moving. You are not their environment. You are your own. And it's time you start tending to it with the same care you gave away so easily, because the moment you do, everything begins to grow again, starting with you. Sometimes the most painful truth is the one you've been avoiding with the most devotion. Not because it's hidden, but because it's simple. You want them to be different. That's it. That's the silent driving force behind every second chance, every internal justification, every time you soften the impact of what they actually did by replacing it with what you hoped they meant. And the more you want them to be someone else, the more you lose sight of what they've already shown you. Radical acceptance doesn't mean you're okay with everything. It means you stop arguing with reality. You stop editing the facts to make your love easier to hold. You stop dressing up the truth just so it hurts less when you look it in the eye. You don't need to agree with someone's behavior to accept it. Acceptance doesn't require approval, it requires presence. The courage to look at what's right in front of you and say, this is who they are, not who I wish they were, not who they could become if everything aligned, just who they are right now. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when you stop fighting the truth, you finally get to decide what to do with it. And that's where freedom begins, not in changing them, but in reclaiming your own agency. You can love someone and still choose distance. You can understand someone's pain and still protect your peace. You can care deeply and still walk away with your dignity intact. There's a version of love we're sold that says staying is proof of strength, that fighting harder means you care more, that leaving is a kind of failure. But what if the real failure is abandoning your own truth just to keep someone else comfortable? What if the greatest act of strength is no longer clinging to the illusion of what could be and finally honoring what is? Radical acceptance isn't about giving up. It's about growing up. It's about realizing that fantasy is comforting, but clarity is liberating. And you can't have both. You've tried everything: compromising, shrinking, stretching, explaining, forgiving, forgetting. But none of it worked, because none of it addressed the core truth: they don't want to change. Or maybe they do, but not in the ways you need. Maybe their love language is inconsistency. Maybe their growth is always coming soon. Maybe they really mean it when they say they'll do better. But meaning well and doing well are two different things. At some point, it's not about whether they're a bad person, it's about whether their truth fits with yours. And if it doesn't, no amount of love will make the pieces align. Carl Jung once said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. And that's the heart of radical acceptance: owning your patterns, owning your projections, owning the part of you that needed them to be someone else to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel whole. Because when you own that, you're no longer at their mercy. You stop waiting for permission to live. You stop negotiating with reality like it owes you a different version of the story. And in that space you stop being afraid of what it means to let go. Because now letting go isn't about bitterness, it's about self-respect. There's a kind of silence that follows this kind of acceptance. Not the silence of resentment, but the silence of peace. The stillness that comes when you're no longer resisting what's true. When you stop waiting for the apology that won't come. When you stop revisiting conversations in your head, trying to find the sentence that might have changed the outcome. When you realize there was no magic phrase, no perfect timing, no missing key, just a relationship that doesn't fit anymore, and maybe never did. That's not a loss. That's a turning point. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Acceptance revokes the illusion. It brings you back to what's yours to control, your response, your choices, your standards. You stop chasing closure from someone who keeps closing the door in different ways. You stop explaining yourself to someone who doesn't listen. You stop fighting for something that only exists in your mind. And with every bit of energy you reclaim, you remember who you were before you bent yourself into someone else's mold. This isn't about indifference, it's about discernment. You can love someone and still say, "This isn't working." You can be compassionate without becoming a doormat. You can be loyal to your truth instead of their potential. Radical acceptance doesn't close your heart. It clears your vision. And once your vision is clear, everything changes. You stop seeing their silence as mystery. You see it as avoidance. You stop seeing their promises as hope. You see them as delay. You stop seeing your suffering as necessary. You see it as optional. And in that clarity, you don't just walk away, you rise. This is what radical acceptance offers. Not a comfortable ending, but a powerful beginning. Not the closure you expected, but the clarity you needed. It doesn't promise that everything will feel good right away. But it does promise that everything will be real. And when your life is rooted in what's real, not even pain can shake it. Because you're no longer afraid of the truth. You're living in it. And that's where all healing starts. Not with changing them, but with freeing yourself. At first, you try to convince yourself it's just a rough patch, that all relationships go through this. You lower your expectations, convince yourself you're asking for too much, tell yourself to be grateful. You trade honesty for harmony. But even harmony feels hollow when your voice disappears from the melody. You make excuses for the distance. You call it space. You tell yourself they're busy. You rationalize their absence, their apathy, their forgetfulness. But deep down, a small voice keeps whispering, "This is not how love is supposed to feel." That voice gets louder when you're alone, when you're lying in bed, pretending to be asleep, when you're smiling in front of others, but your chest feels like a cage, when your tears come without warning and you can't even explain why anymore. By then, your heart has already started to detach. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in fatigue. It's not that you don't care. It's that you're tired of caring alone. Love shouldn't feel like a burden you carry by yourself. It shouldn't leave you guessing, overanalyzing, editing your feelings to avoid being too much. Love, at its core, should feel safe. But when the space that was supposed to hold you becomes the place you feel most unseen, your nervous system learns to protect itself. You don't even notice it at first, but you flinch when they come close. You tense up during conversations. Your laughter becomes forced. Your silence becomes heavy. And your soul starts to crave something more honest, even if it's emptier. That craving is your soul waking up. It's the part of you that's finally ready to stop fighting for someone who stopped showing up a long time ago. The decision to leave rarely arrives in a single moment. It accumulates every time your boundaries were ignored, every time you hoped they'd check in and they didn't, every time you felt lonelier beside them than you did on your own. It builds and it builds, until the weight of staying becomes heavier than the fear of leaving, until the hope that once held everything together begins to feel like the thing that's tearing you apart. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Sometimes the pain that keeps you up at night is not just a barrier. It's the path. It's the signal. It's your body and your soul telling you that something has to change. And that's the quiet truth most people avoid. Knowing is the first form of leaving. You already know. That's why you're here. That's why this hurts so much. Because deep down, you're not searching for an answer. You're searching for the strength to follow the one you already have. It's okay if you're not ready to act on it yet. Awareness doesn't demand action right away. It just demands honesty. And when you finally become honest with yourself, the relationship changes. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because you no longer buy into the illusion. You no longer confuse their almost with effort. You no longer shrink your needs just to avoid being a burden. You no longer call it love when it feels more like silence. That's not bitterness. That's clarity. That's the start of something new, even if it's just an internal shift. Seneca said, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." And choosing to live in truth, to live without the false comfort of a connection that's slowly killing you, is one of the bravest things you'll ever do. Because it means stepping into the unknown. It means grieving a future you hoped for. It means choosing discomfort over disconnection. And that kind of decision doesn't always feel powerful at first. It often feels lonely, raw, unsettling. But over time it turns into freedom. The kind of freedom that lets you breathe again without feeling guilty. The kind that lets you rest without walking on eggshells. The kind that whispers, "You made it out. You chose yourself." So don't wait for the pain to scream. Don't wait for the love to rot. If something inside you knows, it's because the decision is already being made, word by word, night by night, moment by moment. And when the moment finally comes, you won't have to force it. You'll just finally say what your heart's been whispering all along. "I can't do this anymore." And that won't be the end. That will be your beginning. Sometimes the most life-changing decision you'll ever make isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the moment you stop waiting to be chosen and finally choose yourself. If this spoke to something deep in you, don't ignore that. Trust it. Let it guide you to what comes next. Watch the next video on your screen. There's more truth there waiting for you. And thank you for being here, for thinking deeply,